Clara's knees hit the dirt before she even knew she was falling. Her hand scraped the earth, the telegram slipping from her grasp, fluttering away like the last shred of hope she had left. Daniel was gone. California. 6 months ago. No warning. No farewell. No address. She knelt there, her body heavy with the weight of 61 years, her heart even heavier. In the middle of Main Street, Dusty Hollow, Arizona Territory, July 1879, she laughed. It was a dry, bitter sound, one that rose from somewhere deep inside her, a laugh of disbelief. But it didn't last long. The laughter twisted into something darker, something broken. That's when she heard the voice. "Get up!" Clara blinked, her mind still dazed. She hadn't realized she was blocking the road until the woman's sharp words cut through her thoughts. She lifted her head. A figure stood above her, her eyes like sharp glass, her red hair graying at the temples. I said, "Get up." The voice didn't leave room for argument. Clara's throat tightened as she pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her. "Is this some kind of joke?" she whispered, but the woman wasn't laughing. "Not a joke, just facts." The stranger's gaze swept over her like a judge passing sentence. "You're in the way." Clara glanced around, realizing the small crowd that had gathered. Curious townsfolk whispering behind their hands. A mix of men in dusty hats, women with cautious eyes, children pointing. The scene felt like it had been set just for her. A performance she didn't want to star in. But Clara didn't care anymore. Shame wasn't something she had left to give. The woman's sharp eyes softened just a bit as she took in Clara's trembling frame, her dust-covered dress, and the loneliness that clung to her like a second skin. "You got somewhere to go?" The woman's words were clipped, but there was something underneath, something that almost sounded like concern. "That's none of your concern," Clara muttered, the words rough in her throat. "I'm making it my concern," the woman snapped back, uncrossing her arms. "Name's Ruby Dawson. I run the kitchen across the street. You look like you haven't eaten in days." Quote. Clara's stomach growled loudly at the mention of food, but her pride was quick to jump in. "I can't pay for a meal." "Did I ask you to?" Ruby raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a smirk. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a meal and a chance to tell me what brought you here, looking like a woman already dead." Clara hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to be a burden. But Ruby wasn't giving her a choice. She grabbed Clara's carpet bag, which lay discarded in the dust, and shoved it back into her arms. "You can pay me back by being interesting." Ruby's tone left no room for argument. Clara looked down at the bag, everything she owned, and yet it felt so light. How had it all come to this? Ruby turned and began walking across the street toward her kitchen without waiting for Clara to respond. "Come on, before you fall down again and really give these folks something to talk about." What else could Clara do? She followed, step by step, feeling like she was walking into something new, something she couldn't control. The kitchen was small, warm, and smelled of coffee and bacon grease. Clara took a seat at the corner table, her legs still shaky from the fall, while Ruby disappeared into the back. Moments later, Ruby returned with a plate of biscuits, a bowl of stew, and coffee as black as the night sky. "Eat," Ruby said. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for the spoon. She had meant to eat slowly, with some shred of dignity. But the moment the stew hit her tongue, beef, potatoes, carrots, and rich brown gravy, she lost herself. She ate like a starving dog, not caring who saw. The hunger, the loneliness, the years of not being seen. All of it disappeared with each mouthful. When she finished, Ruby was sitting across from her, studying her closely. "Better?" Ruby asked. Clara wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, the warmth in her belly not quite reaching the cold place where her heart had once been. "Yes," she whispered. "Better." Ruby didn't ask anything else at first. She just watched Clara, letting the silence settle between them like a heavy blanket. Then she spoke again, her voice soft but steady. "So what brought you here looking like death on a bad day?" Clara stared at her empty plate, the weight of the question sinking in. "My brother, Daniel Whitmore," she started, her voice raw. "He wrote me 6 months ago. Said he had a claim outside of town. Said I could come live with him. Ruby's gaze didn't falter. But you don't know him. No, Clara whispered. No one does. He's gone. Left for California. Sold his claim. No forwarding address. Nothing. Ruby studied her for a long while, then asked, "And you've got no one else? No husband? No children?" Clara's throat tightened at the question, her past slamming into her all at once. "My husband died 3 years ago. My daughter, she died in childbirth. The baby, too." Clara closed her eyes, the weight of loss still fresh, even after all these years. Ruby didn't say anything, just let Clara sit in the silence, letting the moments stretch between them. Clara sighed. "I was a housekeeper for a family in St. Louis for 30 years. They lost everything, had to let me go." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "They gave me a letter of reference, as if anyone would hire a 61-year-old housekeeper with no connections." Ruby sat back, the silence thick with something unspoken. Finally she asked, "How much you got?" Clara reached into her hem and pulled out the only thing she had left, $11. The bills were worn, crumpled, but they were all she had. Ruby didn't flinch, didn't comment. "That's not enough." Clara looked down at the money in her hand. "I know. And it won't be enough for a room, not enough for much of anything." Clara nodded. "I know." They sat in silence for a long time, the hum of the kitchen around them a reminder of the world moving on, even when she felt stuck, stranded, and forgotten. "What are you going to do?" Ruby's voice was softer now, like she was asking a question she already knew the answer to. Clara looked up at her, her hands shaking slightly as she folded them together on the table. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I've been asking myself that question since I got off that stagecoach." Quote, Ruby didn't say anything at first. She just sat there, looking at Clara with those sharp, assessing eyes. The kind of look that made Clara feel like she was being sized up, judged. And maybe she was. She didn't mind. The truth didn't scare her anymore. "Well," Ruby finally said, breaking the silence, "you better figure it out. And quick. This territory ain't kind to women alone, especially not women your age." Clara's chest tightened. She had heard the rumors, the whispers about women like her, the ones who didn't have anyone to protect them, the ones who lived in the shadows of other people's lives. She knew what people said about old widows and women past their prime. The thought of what lay ahead was enough to bring a cold sweat to the back of her neck. "I'm aware," Clara muttered, her voice rough. Ruby studied her for a moment, then shook her head, almost like she was disappointed. "Are you, though?" Clara met her eyes, the faintest spark of defiance flaring. "I'm not giving up." Ruby's lips curled up into something close to a smile, though there was no humor in it. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Well, looks like you're tougher than you look, then." She walked toward the stove and grabbed the coffee pot, refilling both their cups. The steam rose into the air, a brief moment of warmth in the otherwise oppressive silence. "I don't truck with quitters," Ruby said, sitting back down across from her. Clara didn't respond. Her mind was elsewhere, distant, far from the kitchen, far from the town, far from everything. She thought of Daniel and the letter, how he had promised so much and delivered nothing. She thought of her lost family, her broken heart, and the desperate hope that had been left behind like old clothes she couldn't bear to throw away. Ruby watched her for a long time, then set her cup down, letting the silence stretch again. "You're not from here, are you?" Clara blinked, surprised by the question. "No." "Where you from, then?" "St. Louis." "Uh-huh." Ruby nodded, and Clara could see that the woman wasn't just making conversation. She was sizing her up. "You got family there?" Quote. Clara shook her head, her throat tightening. "No one left." Quote. Ruby sat back, tapping her fingers on the edge of her cup, clearly thinking. After a beat, she spoke again, her tone blunt but surprisingly soft. "You got nothing left, huh?" Clara looked away, her hands shaking just slightly. "I've got $11. Ruby's laugh came out short like a bark. "Well, that's a start." Clara's lip twitched, but she said nothing. Ruby shifted in her chair, getting to her feet and crossing to the back of the kitchen. She moved like someone who knew exactly where everything was, who didn't waste time looking around. "Listen," Ruby called over her shoulder, "I ain't offering you charity. You've got that pride I can see from here. But what I am offering is a chance. A chance to pull yourself out of this mess if you want it." Clara stood slowly, not sure what to make of Ruby's sudden shift in tone. It wasn't kindness exactly, but it wasn't cruelty either. It was something else. Something hard and steady, like the land outside, like the wind that blew across the desert. Ruby returned to her with a piece of paper and a pencil, scribbling something quickly on the back of an envelope. She handed it to Clara without looking up. "Go to this place tomorrow morning," Ruby said. "It's the land office, just down the street. You get yourself a job, and you start making yourself useful around here. This town doesn't need more mouths to feed, but if you're smart, if you've got the guts, you might make something of it." Clara stared at the piece of paper in her hands, her fingers trembling. "I don't know what I can do." "You'll figure it out," Ruby said. "You're not the first woman who's had to survive in a place like this, and you won't be the last." Ruby's eyes softened just a bit, and Clara felt something shift inside her. She was used to people looking at her with pity, but Ruby didn't pity her, not in the way most people did. There was something else there, something like respect. Clara's chest tightened, her heart thumping harder now. She looked down at the paper again, the weight of it like a promise, or maybe a threat. "Go on," Ruby said, pushing her gently toward the door. "I'll hold dinner for you, but don't take too long. I got a business to run." Clara hesitated, her mind running through the options, running through the fear, the uncertainty. But in the end, she did the only thing she could do. She stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, the heat pressing down on her like a weight she had no choice but to bear. She walked down the street toward the land office, each step heavy with uncertainty, but lighter than it had been before. Silas Blackwood had seen a lot of things in his time. A lot of broken people, a lot of hard decisions, and a lot of empty promises. But as he stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching the sun dip low behind the distant hills, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing in a way he wasn't prepared for. He had been living a quiet life since his wife's death, a quiet, solitary life, where the days stretched out before him like a never-ending horizon. And then Clara Whitmore had walked into his life, her stubborn spirit matching his own, her need for something more burning bright behind her weary eyes. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't here for handouts or sympathy. She was here because she had nowhere else to go, and because she refused to let life break her completely. It wasn't much, but it was something, and as much as Silas hated to admit it, it was more than he'd had in years. But the next step, getting her to stay, getting her to see that she had more to offer than she thought, that was the real challenge. He wasn't sure he had the strength to convince her, but as the evening light bathed the mountains in hues of purple and gold, he knew one thing: he couldn't let her go. Not yet. The sound of footsteps behind him brought him back to reality. Ezra stood there, his face as unreadable as always. "She gone yet?" Quote. Silas shook his head slowly. "Not yet, but I think she will be." Ezra raised an eyebrow. "You gonna let her go then?" Silas met his gaze, the weight of his thoughts heavy on his shoulders. "I don't know. Maybe I'll just let her decide." Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat up in the small room above the kitchen, her mind too busy to rest. The bed was small, but it was more than she'd had in months. The quilt was old, but it smelled like cedar, and the pillow, though thin, was soft in a way that was both strange and comforting. But comfort was something she didn't know how to accept anymore. She'd never imagined this. A stranger's kindness. A woman who saw something in her, when all Clara saw was a woman who had been abandoned by everything: family, fortune, purpose. She'd come to Dusty Hollow looking for a brother who didn't even want her, and now she was stuck with a woman whose only offer was a place to sit and talk. But it was a place. A meal. A chance to rebuild. Clara wrapped the quilt tighter around her shoulders, sitting still in the dark room. The only light came from the sliver of moon that filtered through the thin curtains. Somewhere, down below, Ruby was still awake, running her kitchen, waiting for the next person to come in with nothing to offer but their need. And Clara? She didn't know what she had to offer. The next morning, Clara woke before the sun and left the small room quietly. She didn't want to disturb Ruby or anyone else who might be sleeping. The air was cool and dry, and Dusty Hollow was still waking up. The town was quiet, the dust swirling in the wind like 1,000 little whispers of the past. Clara stood in front of the land office, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what she expected. A job? A place to stay? A miracle? Whatever it was, she felt out of place, out of time, as though she had stumbled into someone else's life. The door creaked open as she stepped inside, the smell of old paper and ink hitting her like a slap. The man behind the desk looked up, his eyes sharp, calculating. He didn't smile. He didn't ask if she needed help. He simply waited for her to speak. "I was told this is where I can find work," Clara said, her voice steady but unsure. The man studied her, looking her up and down like she was a puzzle he wasn't sure how to solve. "I got a few places that could use help," he said after a long pause, his voice gruff and no nonsense. "You willing to do hard work?" Clara nodded quickly. "I've done hard work all my life." The man's eyes softened just a bit, but only for a moment. "You want it bad enough. You'll prove it. Show up tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock. Don't be late." Clara barely had time to thank him before she was out the door, the weight of the conversation settling in her chest. She had a job, a place to start, a chance at something new. She had no idea what that something was yet, but she was determined to find out. By the time Clara made her way back to Ruby's kitchen, the sun was fully up, casting a harsh light over the town. Ruby was already at work, her hands moving quickly, making coffee, cooking eggs, getting everything ready for the day. "You get it?" Ruby asked as Clara stepped inside. Clara nodded, a nervous excitement bubbling up inside her. "I start tomorrow, 9 o'clock, quote. Ruby's lips twitched. "Good, don't expect to be treated like a guest here. You're gonna earn your place. Got a few rules. Don't complain. Don't ask for charity. And don't expect to be coddled. I don't have time for that." "I won't," Clara said, her voice firm. Ruby gave her a sharp look, then a half smile. "Good. You're gonna need all the grit you've got. And you've got more than you think. I've seen it in you since you walked in here." Clara's heart fluttered, a strange warmth filling her chest. No one had ever said something like that to her before. Not since Samuel had died. Not since the world had broken her apart and left her with nothing. But Ruby believed in her. Maybe, just maybe, she could believe in herself again too. The next morning, Clara walked the few short blocks to the ranch she'd been assigned to. The sun was already high in the sky, and the heat hit her like a wall the moment she stepped onto the property. The ranch was sprawling, the land stretching out for miles, the barn standing tall and sturdy against the horizon. It was a place of work, a place of sweat and dirt and dust, and it was exactly what Clara needed. The man in charge, a grizzled older fellow with a weathered face and hands like rough leather, took one look at her and grunted. "You ready to work?" Clara squared her shoulders. "Yes, sir." "You'll start in the barn," he said, pointing to the far side of the property. "Get to it." And that was how Clara spent the next few hours, sweating, aching, lifting hay bales, mucking out stalls. It wasn't easy, but it wasn't supposed to be. She had no illusions about what hard work meant. It was a chance, a lifeline, and she would do everything in her power to make it work. By noon, the work had worn her thin, her muscles sore from the unfamiliar labor. She wiped the sweat from her brow and paused, her eyes scanning the ranch. The other hands were busy with their own tasks, moving with the practiced ease of men who had been raised in this life. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him. Silas Blackwood. He was standing near the barn, his weathered face hard as stone, his hands resting at his sides. He was watching her, his blue-gray eyes piercing through the heat and the dust, and for a moment, Clara froze. There was something about him that unsettled her. The way he stood there, still and strong, like he had seen and lived through a lifetime of things no one could imagine. And yet, In that moment, he looked at her not with pity, but with something else, something that made her heart race, a mix of recognition and understanding. "Clara!" A voice called out, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Ruby, standing by the kitchen door, waving her over. "Lunch is ready." Clara gave Silas one last glance before turning away, her heart pounding in her chest. What did that look meant? Was it just curiosity? Or was there something more? She didn't know. But as she walked back toward the kitchen, the questions lingered in her mind, just like the heat that wrapped around her. Clara spent the next few days working herself into the rhythm of the ranch. It was hard, exhausting, but it felt good to have purpose again. To have a reason to wake up in the morning. Ruby didn't go easy on her, but Clara didn't want her to. She had to prove something, not just to Ruby or the ranch hands, but to herself. She hadn't given up, not yet. And every day, as she worked alongside the others, she felt something else stirring inside her. A small flicker of hope. Maybe this place wasn't as lonely as she thought. Later that week, when the sun began to dip low and the air turned cool, Silas found her in the barn again. She was checking on one of the horses that had been acting strange, its coat slick with sweat. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, his eyes on her, his face unreadable. Then, with a slow, measured step, he crossed the threshold, the creak of the barn door sounding louder than usual. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Clara glanced up at him, surprised, but nodded. "Just making sure she's all right." Silas stepped closer, his boots echoing in the barn. "She looks fine." Clara gave him a small smile. "She's got a little more spirit than I do today." Quote, Silas let out a breath, his lips twitching like he was about to say something, but instead he just nodded. "You're doing good work." Clara looked at him, the unexpected praise catching her off guard. "Thank you." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet of the barn settling between them like an old friend. The horse shifted in the stall, and Silas stepped back, glancing at the other animals around them. "I see you're adjusting," he said finally. "Better than I expected." Clara's heart skipped a beat at his words. There was no judgment in them, no pity, just simple recognition. "I'm trying." "You're not giving up," Silas said, his voice soft but firm. Clara met his gaze, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Not yet. But there was something there, something that wasn't just about survival. Maybe it was about beginning again. Clara woke the next morning to the sound of the rooster crowing and the smell of coffee wafting up the stairs. For the first time since she arrived in Dusty Hollow, the day didn't feel like an impossible burden. She had a routine now, a place, and the chance to start over. Small steps, one at a time. Ruby had made it clear there was no room for hesitation here. Either Clara would commit to the hard work, or she would leave. But something inside her, something fierce and stubborn, kept her from running. She dressed quickly in the plain clothes she'd brought with her, the fabric worn but sturdy, and made her way downstairs. Ruby was already at the stove, a pot of coffee brewing, the scent strong enough to wake the dead. The kitchen was filled with the sounds of morning, crackling fire, the clink of dishes, and Ruby's voice humming something low, like a tune she hadn't quite remembered. "Sleep well." Ruby's question was more a formality than genuine concern, but Clara didn't mind. "Better than I've had in months," she replied, the words strange on her tongue. A simple truth, but one that still felt new. Ruby didn't comment, just handed her a mug of coffee and gestured to the table. "Sit. You'll need your strength today." Clara took the mug, the warmth of it seeping into her cold fingers. As she sat, she felt a bit of the tension in her chest ease, just for a moment. She hadn't allowed herself to think too much in the past week. There hadn't been room for thoughts of what she was leaving behind. Her husband, her daughter, the life she used to have. There was only the here and now, and that was enough. Ruby finished cooking, setting down plates of eggs and bacon, biscuits and gravy. The food was simple but hearty, and Clara's stomach growled in anticipation. "Big day today," Ruby said, sitting across from her. "You're going to help with the cattle. Ain't glamorous, but it'll teach you more than you'll learn in that office." Clara nodded. She had no illusions about the work. She had spent enough time on farms and estates, cleaning, cooking, doing the things that no one else wanted to do. But she was tired of only surviving. It was time to live again. Ruby watched her closely, as if waiting for a reaction, then finally spoke. "Don't let the men treat you like a fool out there. You're just as capable as any of them. You do the work. You earn your place." Quote. Clara looked up, meeting Ruby's gaze. "I can do it." Ruby's lips curled up into a tight smile. "I think you'll prove that to everyone, including yourself." The sun was already hot by the time Clara reached the cattle pens. She could feel the sweat beginning to trickle down her back, the heat of the Arizona summer pressing down on her. But she pushed through. She had work to do, no more hiding, no more waiting for someone else to save her. The ranch foreman, Ezra, was already there, his face like stone, but his eyes sharp as ever. When he saw Clara approach, he raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything. The other hands were gathered, preparing the cattle for branding, their voices low, their movements practiced. Clara stepped into the pen with them, her feet slipping on the dry earth, but she steadied herself quickly. She had no intention of stumbling. Ezra was the first to speak, his voice rough as gravel. "You ready to work?" Clara squared her shoulders, the words familiar but no less daunting. "I'm ready." Quote. The work was hard. Handling cattle wasn't a job for the faint of heart. There was no room for weakness, no space for hesitation. Ezra showed her how to handle the ropes, how to move the cattle without spooking them, how to make the branding process efficient. She felt her arms begin to ache, her body protesting with every movement. But she didn't stop. Every time she felt like she couldn't go any longer, she remembered Ruby's words. She had to prove something. To herself. To everyone else. And when she did, the men stopped looking at her like she was a stranger. They began to see her for what she was. Another worker. Another hand on the ranch. By noon, the branding was finished, and the cattle were safely returned to the pasture. Clara stood, hands on her hips, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Her body covered in dirt and sweat, but it felt good. For the first time in a long time, it felt like she was doing something that mattered. Ezra nodded toward her, his face still unreadable. "Not bad." Clara wiped her brow with the back of her hand, a tired smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you." But Ezra didn't smile back. He just gave a grunt and turned back to the men who were gathering their things and heading toward the bunkhouse. Clara watched them for a moment, then turned to leave. She had enough time to clean up before Ruby would be expecting her back in the kitchen for the evening meal. As she walked toward the bunkhouse, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance, the rhythmic clopping of a horse growing louder. Clara glanced up, squinting against the afternoon sun. She saw him then, Silas Blackwood, riding his horse toward the barn. His silhouette was tall against the backdrop of the mountains, his expression serious, like always. Something shifted in Clara's chest, a fluttering sensation she couldn't quite explain. The truth was, Silas had been in her thoughts more often than she cared to admit. His quiet strength, the way he moved with purpose, the way his eyes seemed to understand things she didn't even say. It made her feel like she was seeing the world through someone else's eyes. As he rode past her, he didn't stop, but his gaze lingered on her for a fraction of a second, just long enough to make her heart skip a beat. And then he was gone, his horse carrying him toward the barn, toward the work that would never end. Clara stood there for a moment, the dust from the cattle pen settling around her. She couldn't make sense of the feelings that bubbled up inside her. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to feel anything other than pain or loss. But there it was, something different. Hope. Maybe that was the secret to moving forward. To living again. Not to forget the past, but to embrace the future, with all its unknowns. Later that evening, after dinner, Clara found herself back at the barn, checking on the animals. The sky above her was darkening, the stars beginning to peek through the velvet blackness. The air was cooling, a welcome relief from the heat of the day. She heard footsteps behind her, slow but steady. Without turning, she knew who it was. Evening. Silas's voice was low, quiet. Clara turned to face him. "Evening." Quote. Silas stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his eyes studying her. She could feel the weight of his gaze, and for a moment, it felt like everything else faded away. "I see you've been working hard," he said, his voice a little softer than usual. Clara nodded. "I have to. You're doing well." The praise was simple, but it meant more to her than she could say. She didn't know why, but it did. Clara took a deep breath, gathering the courage to say the next words. "Thank you, Silas, for giving me a chance." He didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, watching her with those piercing eyes. Finally, he gave a small nod. "You've earned it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The night was quiet, except for the distant sounds of the ranch, the rustling of the animals, and the occasional hoot of an owl. And Clara realized, for the first time since she'd stepped off the stagecoach in Dusty Hollow, that maybe, just maybe, she was starting to belong here. The next few days felt like something new, something that Clara had almost forgotten existed. Rhythm. It wasn't a fast pace, nor was it smooth, but it was a pace she could follow. Every morning she rose with the sun, her body aching from the previous day's work but still eager to start the next. The land, the ranch, the people, everything here was unfamiliar. But as the days passed, Clara started to feel a part of it. A small part, yes, but a part nonetheless. Ruby's words echoed in her mind often. "Prove it to yourself." Clara was still working hard, helping in the barn, learning the ropes of the ranch, and starting to earn the respect of the men she worked with. Ezra, for all his gruffness, hadn't thrown any more insults her way. The other hands gave her a nod when they passed, a silent acknowledgement of the work she'd put in. And Silas, he still watched her, not with pity, but with something else that she couldn't quite name. That something lingered in the back of her mind as she walked down the path to the ranch house one afternoon, her feet dragging slightly as the heat of the day began to ease. "Clara." She paused, hearing her name called out from behind. Silas's voice was low, rough as always. When she turned, she saw him standing near the barn, his back to the golden light of the setting sun. He hadn't moved since he called her, just waiting. "Need something?" she asked, the words coming out smoother than she'd expected. He gave a slow nod, stepping toward her. "Walk with me." Clara hesitated for a moment, the familiar weight of her work boots heavy on her feet. But she didn't question him. She simply nodded and followed. The path that led toward the front gate wasn't long, but the quiet was all-encompassing. There were no sounds but the occasional shuffle of hooves or the soft chirp of distant insects. And then, just as they reached the edge of the ranch property, Silas spoke. "Ruby says you've been working hard." Clara glanced at him, surprised by the sudden acknowledgement. "I've been trying." "You're doing well," Silas said. "Better than I expected." Clara's chest tightened at the unexpected praise. She had worked hard for it. She had worked for everything since the moment she arrived. But hearing it from him, from someone who had seen the land, the work, and the people, there was something in his voice that made her feel like maybe she wasn't as invisible as she'd been before. "I'm glad," she murmured, her voice quieter than usual. They reached the gate, and Silas stopped, his eyes turned toward the horizon. The vastness of the land stretching out before them. "The ranch needs someone," he said after a long pause, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken years. "It's been a long time since anyone's cared enough to make it what it could be." Clara frowned, the question on the tip of her tongue. "What are you saying?" Silas turned to look at her, the evening light casting long shadows on his face. "I'm saying you've earned a place here, Clara. I see that." The words were simple, but they felt like a promise. Something more than just work, something that felt like a chance. For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara realized she was starting to believe that maybe this place could be a home. Maybe she could be something more than just a woman with nothing. "I'm not asking for much," Silas added. "Just that you stay. Help me with this. Help me build it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and full of meaning. Clara looked down at the dirt beneath her feet, thinking. She hadn't expected him to say anything like this. She hadn't expected anyone to offer something more than just survival. "You don't have to ask me," she said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." Silas's expression softened, just slightly, and for a moment Clara saw something in his eyes, something that wasn't just about the ranch, about the land, or even about the work. It was a quiet understanding, a flicker of connection, He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Good. I think you'll find it's not as bad as you think. They stood there for a while, both of them looking out over the land. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of purple and orange. The world felt vast, and for the first time in ages, Clara didn't feel as small as she used to. She wasn't just a shadow anymore. She was part of something bigger. The days that followed were filled with more work. The cattle needed attention, the barns needed mending, and the land demanded constant care. But with each passing day, Clara found herself more at ease. She had settled into a routine that felt right, the work hard but satisfying, the company steady and reliable. And then came the moment that surprised her. It was an ordinary afternoon, and Clara was out by the barn, checking on the horses when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Clara?" She turned to see Silas approaching, his gait slow but steady. He wasn't riding a horse today. Instead, he walked toward her with purpose. "Got something to show you," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners like he was trying not to smile. Clara raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Quote, "A little something I think you'll like." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the barn. Clara looked past him, her curiosity piqued. As she stepped closer, she saw it. A small, dusty cart was sitting at the edge of the barn, a bundle of fresh hay piled neatly inside. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The cart had been built with care, with time, and with intention. "This is for you," Silas said simply. Clara blinked, her heart skipping in her chest. "For me?" Silas gave a small nod. "You've been working hard, and I know how much you've been putting in. Thought you might need a little something to help." Clara stepped forward, her hand resting on the edge of the cart. It was a gesture that felt almost too personal, too kind. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. "I don't know what to say." Silas's smile grew a little wider. "You don't have to say anything. Just take it. Use it however you need." Clara looked at him, her chest tight with emotion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough. Silas nodded, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "You've earned it, Clara. And you've earned more than that." Clara swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle deep inside her. She had come to this place with nothing. No family, no purpose, no future. But maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to find something worth holding on to. The days after that moment seemed to pass in a blur. Clara continued her work on the ranch, but she also began to see the subtle changes in herself, in the way she approached the world around her. The cart became her new companion, a reminder of how far she had come and how much she had left to give. And then, one evening, as the sun began to set and the ranch settled into the quiet of the night, Silas joined her once again. "You've done good here," he said, his voice quiet, almost gentle. Clara glanced up at him, a soft smile curling at the corner of her lips. "I'm not done yet." Silas stood beside her, his hands resting on the fence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the mountains. Finally, Silas turned to her. "I'm glad you stayed." Clara looked at him, her heart full in a way she hadn't expected. "So am I." And for the first time since she'd arrived, Clara felt like she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. The days passed, and with each one, Clara found herself more at ease in this new life, this new world she had stumbled into. Silas, the ranch, the land. It had all become a rhythm she could follow. She had a purpose now, a place where her hands could be busy and her heart could heal. But even with all the progress, there were moments of doubt, moments when the past seemed to catch up with her, like a shadow she couldn't outrun. She often thought of Samuel, of her daughter, of the life she had lost. The pain never truly left, but it became more bearable, less consuming. One afternoon, as Clara sat on the porch of the ranch house, her hands busy with mending a tear in her dress, Silas came out to join her. The evening sun had begun to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land, painting everything in golds and purples. "You're quiet," Silas said, sitting down beside her. His presence was comforting, like the land itself had become a part of her. Clara glanced at him, her heart giving a slight tug at the way he looked at her, no longer with the distance of a stranger, but with something deeper, something more familiar. "Just thinking," she said, her voice soft. "About what?" "About everything," Clara replied, not sure how to put it all into words. "About how much has changed and how much still feels the same." Silas was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon. "I know what you mean," he said, his voice rough. "A lot of things don't change, no matter how hard you try to make them. But the things that do, they're worth holding on to." Clara nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words settle into her chest. She had come here with nothing, unsure of what the future held. But in these last few weeks, in the quiet moments between the work and the silence, she had found something she hadn't realized she was looking for: peace. The sound of hooves approaching broke the silence. Clara looked up, seeing Ezra and the other hands returning from the day's work. As always, they rode in like men who knew the land, who knew the rhythm of the earth beneath their feet. Silas stood, his body stiff from the long hours spent in the sun. He turned to Clara. "I've been thinking about something," he said, his eyes serious. Clara stood as well, sensing the shift in the air. "What about?" "I think it's time to make it official," Silas said, his voice low but steady. Clara blinked, not sure if she understood. "Official?" Silas nodded. "You've been here long enough, you've earned your place, you've worked hard, and you've shown me that you're not just here to survive. You're here to build something." Clara felt a strange flutter in her chest, a mixture of fear and excitement. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying it's time we made this real," Silas said, his gaze steady. "We've been living together for a while now. And I think it's time we made it official. You and me, Clara. I'm asking you to stay, to be a part of this family, for good." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The words hung in the air between them, as heavy as the land itself. She had never imagined this, never thought she would be standing here with a man who had offered her more than a place to sleep, more than a meal. He had offered her a future. "I'm not asking for love," Silas said, his voice rough but honest. "Not yet, but I am asking for something real. Something we can build together." Clara's heart raced, her mind spinning with the possibilities. She had come to this place with nothing, no family, no home, no future. But now, Silas was offering her all of that, and in that moment, Clara knew. She knew that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She wasn't alone, not anymore. "I want that," she whispered, her voice steady. "I want to stay, to build something with you." Silas smiled, a rare, genuine smile that made him look younger, softer, in a way Clara hadn't seen before. Then it settled. The wedding wasn't a grand affair. There was no preacher, no ceremony in front of a crowd. But it didn't need to be. It was just them, Silas and Clara, standing in the quiet of the barn, exchanging vows in front of Ezra, who had agreed to stand as witness, and Ruby, who had brought flowers from the wilds of the land. Clara had never imagined such a simple, quiet moment could feel so profound. The air was thick with something between them, something real. And when Silas took her hand, his grip warm and steady, she knew, for the first time in her life, that she had found a place where she belonged. "I, Silas Edward Blackwood," he said, his voice steady and sure, "take you, Clara Louise Whitmore, to be my wife, to share this land, this life, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, for as long as we both shall live." Clara smiled, her eyes brimming with tears she hadn't expected. "I, Clara Louise Whitmore, take you, Silas Edward Blackwood, to be my husband. To stand by you, to build a life with you, for as long as we both shall live." When they kissed, it wasn't passionate, not like the stories she had once read in books. It was quiet, slow, the kind of kiss that said everything, without needing words. They were bound, not by love alone, but by something deeper, by respect, by shared struggles, and by a promise to face whatever came next, together. The days after the wedding passed in a blur. Clara worked alongside Silas, Ezra, and the hands, rebuilding what had been lost, making the ranch not just a place of survival, but a home. The land, once harsh and unforgiving, began to feel like something more. something that was theirs. And slowly, Silas's son, William, began to come around. At first, he had been hesitant, unsure of what to make of this new arrangement, but over time, he started to see it for what it was: a family, imperfect and messy, but real. They worked together, side by side, their bond growing stronger each day. The barn, once a symbol of loss and destruction, was rebuilt. The land began to thrive again, just as Clara had, but the greatest change, the one that Clara had never expected, was in Silas. He laughed more, he smiled more, and for the first time in years, Clara saw the weight of his past begin to lift. One evening, as the stars began to appear in the sky, Silas took Clara's hand in his, looking out at the land they had made their own. "I never thought I'd see this day," he said softly. "A family, a home, a future." Clara squeezed his hand. "Neither did I." He turned to her, his eyes full of something new, hope. "But we've got it, Clara, and I'll never let it go." Clara smiled, the warmth of his words filling her heart. "Neither will I." And together they watched the stars appear in the night sky, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together.